We've known for a long time that pricing carbon is an essential component of any sensible response that the government might make to the climate change problem. But there are of course many ways to do that, and what I prefer to focus on is how you value carbon, how you build a response that's appropriate to your place, that fits with your political culture. It's a kind of whatever works strategy. If you can regulate in a way that allows companies to properly price carbon internally, then fine. If you want to use a taxation system, that could work too. If you want to use emissions trading, that's also a device that we know helps deliver a signal into a marketplace that businesses can respond to and investors can respond to. Now, we know that a number of governments are experimenting with their own pricing mechanisms, and in Europe we've had one for some time, and we know also what doesn't work and how they need to be improved to make them fit for purpose. But we also have a strong conviction that unless we price carbon, we're effectively subsidizing those who pollute. And the more we effectively value carbon, the easier it is for economies to become more efficient, for the circular economy to be a practical reality where businesses feel confident that the efficiencies that they make in the production cycle, in the way they use waste, in the way they develop intelligent alternatives to fossil fuels today, will be rewarded for the public good that's associated with a more stable climate system. So we absolutely have to do this. It's a question of how and where and what's most appropriate in the political circumstances each government has to face. A number of governments now have developed mechanisms which value carbon, and they're really very diverse. In addition to the European Union, we know there are several provinces in China that are developing their own particular carbon pricing regimes. We know that places like Mexico and Korea and Chile, they're all looking at ways of putting a price on carbon in their own way, in their own jurisdictions. Now, all of this will be helpful to the multilateral process, which culminates in an agreement in 2015 in Paris. And I'm confident there will be an agreement in Paris. However, it will not look like the Kyoto Protocol. It would be unreasonable to expect it to establish a single global price in carbon. That's not what's going to happen. However, it is possible to imagine a kind of handshake commitment binding between governments to establish in their own way, in their own time, a value for carbon, and to have that meet international standards and methodologies that have been tried and tested over the last decade or so, and to have that reported so that there's some measurement of performance against that international standard, and to have the multilateral process review year on, year out what governments are doing that's effective at delivering emission reductions at scale in accordance with the scientific evidence that we have that economies need to reduce really rather significant amounts of carbon over a relatively short period of time, i.e. over the next couple of decades. My sense here is that if you build something credible that the parties really believe the other parties will implement, the system will have more authority, more credibility with a wider range of actors than a hortatorial declaratory statement of intent. You can imagine the USA and China and India shaking hands on building a regime in their own place that values carbon in their own way, whereas you can't imagine them accepting a top-down regime that allocates quotas to each of them to be enforced by the UN system. That is not on the cards right now. But it doesn't mean that the agreement will be a lesser agreement. It just means it will be based on something that you can agree will be implemented by the other. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm not expecting an international agreement that establishes a single price for carbon. But it's worth pushing for an international agreement that values carbon in ways that has sufficient diversity and variety of context that will actually be implemented and will affect decisions made by businesses every day in those jurisdictions and between jurisdictions, in the trade between those jurisdictions. That's credible, that's realistic. But it's not any less ideal either, because I think we've entered a phase where the marketplace is so complex, the range of actions so varied, that we should expect there to be a diversity of response, so long as we know what each is talking about, so long as we have an international standard to measure performance by, we know what a ton of carbon reduced looks like, and we meet regularly to compare how each country is doing in furtherance of an agreed global objective. And those three elements you need to have in whatever agreement we have in 2015. A genuine commitment to reduce, a genuine objective that can be achieved through a variety of means, a measure for comparing performance, and the commitment to keep the engagement at the international level behind that initial handshake. When most businesses look at the 2015 agreement on climate change, its potential to affect their decision making, same is true of investors, they're not depending upon the outcome. They're not building their strategies on the basis that there is an agreement or any particular type of agreement. They'll have to have all sorts of other ways of coping. They'll look at regional agreements, they'll look at what cities are doing, they'll look at their national governments. But believe me, if there is an agreement, and it's really worth pushing for an international agreement in 2015, a legally binding one, they'll notice. They'll adjust their decision making. They'll make sure they make decisions that are in tune with that outcome. And they'll know that there's a link between what is done at the global level and what's done at the EU and what's done at the national level. And they'll know that politicians who are stalling, who are waiting for someone else to go first, who are blaming the failure to act at the global level on their own inaction, will have less cause for standing in the way of a change, a transformational change that most businesses know is inevitable.